This segment of the Chopin podcast is brought to you by the Chopin Foundation of the United States, presenters of the National Chopin Competition in Miami, Florida, January 2025.
Ever had a bad vacation? Chopin did once. But had he never traveled to the Spanish island of Majorca in the fall of 1838, or had his vacation been a bit sunnier, he would never have composed his 24 preludes, at least not in the exact form we know them today. Joining us to tell the story of Chopin's trip to Majorca is Alan Walker, Professor Emeritus at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. Best known for his magisterial 3-volume biography of Franz Liszt, Walker recently published a biography of Chopin that is somehow at the highest standard of scholarly rigor, while at the same time being a real page-turner. So without further ado, let's travel back in time with Alan Walker to discover the origins of Chopin's Preludes.
In 1838, Chopin was 28 years old. He had recently met and fallen in love with George Sand, the famous French novelist, Aurora Dudevant. She had changed her name to George Sand for professional writing purposes. They were living secretly together in the autumn of 1838. Chopin, I think, was very nervous that his parents and his friends back in Warsaw might find out about this liaison, because he was a very circumspect, very private person. But the idea of going to Majorca really had less to do with Chopin and much more to do with George Sand's son, Maurice, who was an adolescent at that point, and he was suffering from a kind of rheumatism. George Sand was worried about him, and she asked her friend and neighbor, Charlotte Mauliani, who was married to the Spanish consul, what might be the best climate for her son Maurice. And immediately, Madame Mauliani said, "Why don't you try going to Majorca? It has a wonderful climate, and the sunshine will do him good." So at that point, the decision was made, and it was simply idly suggested to Chopin that he might care to join them. And it wasn't until the very last moment that Chopin did join them, because George Sand and her 2 children, Solange, her younger daughter, and Maurice, the son, who, by the way, was a gifted artist already, having been a student of Delacroix, the great painter, Chopin decided that he would join them after all, and he was delayed because he had to go, first of all, to see his banker, August Leo, who loaned him 1,000 francs. Then he had to go to see his publisher and the piano manufacturer, Camille Pleyel, because he knew that he couldn't compose without a piano. So he ordered a piano, and at that point, it was decided that Chopin would dedicate to Pleyel the 24 preludes, which were in the process of being composed. And so Chopin took a portfolio of manuscripts with him, and he joined George Sand and her children in Perpignan, and then he traveled down through Spain to Barcelona, and eventually, after some delays, they boarded this little paddle steamer that had just been built in Scotland and launched a few months earlier, called El Malacan, the Mallorcan, and it took them about 8 or 10 hours to cross the Mediterranean from Barcelona to Palma, and that's where they landed, and that is where they stayed for 59 days. Now, it was clearly George Sand's intention to stay there for much longer. She wanted privacy to write, and she thought also the climate, the Mediterranean climate, would be beneficial for Chopin. But that, of course, as I said a little earlier, was an afterthought. In Parma, they had great difficulty in finding accommodation. We know that George Sand left her 2 children and Chopin and the maid Amélie on the quayside with their suitcases while she went off in search of accommodation. And the only place she could find were 2 rooms on La Calle de la Marina, I believe the street was called, leading straight to the port. It was dirty, disheveled, noisy, and they could only stay there for a few nights because neither Sand nor Chopin could stand the din. In desperation, George Sand contacted some of her diplomatic friends. She had letters of introduction with her to various people in Parma, and they found a house in one of the suburbs called Saint-Vin, which is a Catalonian phrase, and it means the house of wind. And they stayed there throughout a month. And we have letters from both Chopin and George Sand saying, "This is absolute bliss. We've never known a paradise like this. The sky is blue. We hear the birds singing, the flowers, the perfumes. We hear the mandolins playing at night. No painter could have created such a scene." This is one of George Sand's phrases. Well, paradise soon turned into purgatory. The rain started to fall. The unglazed windows of the house let in the damp air, and Chopin became seriously ill. In desperation, George Sand called in a doctor, and much to her surprise, he brought in two of his colleagues. And we have an hilarious account from Chopin himself. After they had examined Chopin, he said that the first doctor said that he was about to die. The second doctor said he was dying. And the third doctor said he was dead already. Chopin was very good at poking fun at himself in desperate situations like this. But then, of course, the worst thing happened. The doctors, they were legally duty-bound to report any infectious illness on the island, and they reported that Chopin had tuberculosis. George Sand went to a grave denying that Chopin had tuberculosis, but there's no doubt at all that he had, and it's that basically what killed him in the end. Fortunately, although they were about to be thrown out of that house by the landlord, who were charged George Sand a horrendous amount of money for burning the bedding and the furniture and cleaning the walls, whitewashing all the walls and getting rid of this family. Her children were stoned in the streets. She herself could not get provisions from the locals because of the fear of contamination from the disease. But a day or two earlier, she had just taken out a lease on 3 modules in the cell of a deserted monastery in Valldemossa, which was a little village about 25, 30 kilometers outside of Parma, perched halfway up a hillside. And she decided that that's where they had to go. That was their refuge. As evidence, of course, that they wanted to stay there for far longer, because we now know that George Sand had taken a lease for 1 year on those apartments. But it was all to end because Chopin became so ill, she had to get him back to the mainland. But in the meantime, here we are, after 1 month in Parma, and about to take up residence in Valldemossa, in this deserted monastery. We now know that they occupied cell number 4, which consisted of 3 rather small rooms. I was there, as a matter of fact, just 2 weeks ago, and was able to check out these things for myself. When Chopin and Sand took possession of the 3 modules, Chopin likened his own room to an upright coffin. He was, in fact, not enthralled exactly, but the first thing he observed was the vaulted ceiling. But the idea that he thought he was living inside an inverted coffin would have perhaps affected the state of his mind for the entire duration of his stay there. It was cramped accommodation because there were 4 of them, plus the housemaid. And George Sand also engaged the services of a local girl for cooking and generally keeping the place clean. But that's where Chopin completed his 24 preludes, but he had another hardship to contend with, because he couldn't find a decent piano anywhere on the island. The piano that he'd already ordered and had been shipped out by Pleyel had been held up in Marseille. Finally, it was shipped to Parma, but then customs seized it, and they wouldn't release it until Chopin, in his own words, had paid 500 francs for the damned thing. He really was so tired of not having access to a good piano, but he found what George Sand described as a poor, wretched Majorcan instrument, and that, together with all their belongings, was taken up by a handcart and a couple of mules to Valldemossa, and it was on that wretched instrument that some of the preludes were brought to life. Now, I should say at this point that 3 or 4 of the preludes had already been completed before Chopin ever went to Majorca. We know, for example, that the celebrated, the little A major one, played by every schoolboy, that had been composed years earlier because it appears in pupils' autograph books in the hand of Chopin. And we also know that the much more significant prelude, the one in A-flat major, with the tolling A-flats in the left hand, that was already composed as well. Some were in embryonic form, they were in Chopin's portfolio, and they were completed on the island. 1 or 2 others were composed complete on the island. They certainly included number 2 in A minor, and number 15 in D-flat major, the so-called raindrop prelude. And that, of course, opens up an entirely new subject, raindrops and Chopin. And what do we do with such a story? I have my views, and I'll share them with you.
I think you've set the scene gloriously, and it makes me wonder if they had stayed in Palma, and Chopin hadn't gotten sick and was never examined by doctors, first, would we even have the Preludes? And if so, what would they sound like? I imagine maybe not as morbid as the final version we have today.
I mean, this kind of question, in the case of Chopin, is more difficult than perhaps with any other composer, because he was almost indifferent to his surroundings. Unlike Liszt, for example, who gives away the game with practically every piece that he wrote because he gives it a title, and you know where he was and what he was doing and what it's supposed to mean and represent. But Chopin is not a representational composer. Now, there's a great deal, and I believe in this, there's a great deal to the fact that music represents the life of the mind, but certainly doesn't represent a book or a painting or a play or a scene of nature. At least Chopin didn't believe it did. And whenever anyone tried to palm off, as it were, ideas, non-musical ideas, and attach them to his pieces, he strenuously objected. He certainly objected to George Sand's depiction of the D-flat major prelude being the raindrop prelude. We know from her account in her autobiography, The Story of My Life, she leaves some details about this. It's not in A Winter in Mallorca, where she doesn't even mention Chopin by name, although she attacks everybody within sight, especially those who gave her a hard time. She simply refers to Chopin in that book as our poor invalid, or someone who was suffering and needed great attention, which he didn't get from the local peasants with whom she was surrounded. But in The Story of Her Life, which, by the way, goes on for more than 1,000 pages before she even gets around to Chopin, and she compresses him into a couple of chapters right at the very end. But she tells us there that she and her son Maurice had to go to Parma for provisions, and it was raining, and the carter and his mule were stranded halfway up the mountain. And she says that he abandoned them, and they had to find their own way back home. When she got back, she found Chopin in a state of near fright, according to her. He'd been listening to the rain, and he'd been mesmerized by the sound of droplets on the roof of the monastery, and had unconsciously translated them into those repeated A-flats, which in the middle section are enharmonically changed to G-sharps. But the repeated A-flat G-sharp goes on throughout the piece, as you know. And when Chopin heard this story, according to George Sand herself, he objected. He said, "It's not an illustrative piece at all. My pieces, my music, they do not represent anything." But it's very interesting that whenever this work is played now, it's George Sand's recollection, a false recollection of what she thought Chopin meant, as opposed to what Chopin really meant, that we recall. Because it is a piece like every other piece that Chopin wrote, of absolute independent music, without any reference to anything in the outside world.
I wonder, because I believe fully that that's Chopin's commitment to the ideology of absolute music. And he when he composed, he didn't have any kind of referent or representation in mind. Nevertheless, just like you say, and you are a biographer, one's circumstances seep into their work. And I wonder, especially thinking of the D-flat prelude, the so-called raindrop prelude, when it does transpose to its inharmonic parallel minor of C-sharp minor and the A-flats turn to G-sharps, it's one of the most morbid sort of deep intonings of, one could imagine, a kind of abandoned monastery and ghostly monks. Now, this is our imagination run wild, but I mean, at least would you concede that there could be some subconscious source of inspiration or influence, given all of the emotions he's dealing with, given this sort of terrifying haunted house that he's living in? surely that has some bearing on the composition of especially that middle passage. Would you concur, or do you stay away from these sorts of things?
No, I don't concur, and I don't stay away. In fact, I will ask you a question. If we had no knowledge of the story that George Sand attached to that piece, would you think of raindrops?
I'm throwing out the raindrops, but I'm wondering about the morbidity, the sort of, I feel death lurking. And I think I would feel that even if I never knew anything about Chopin's biography.
I think probably we might be talking about two different things, because certainly music does reflect and express the life of the mind. There's no question about that. But that's quite a different matter than reflecting the outside world. To reflect the inner life of the mind is not at all the same thing as illustrating things that are going on, like birdsong or scenes of nature or paintings. That's an entirely different world, and we call it program music. And Chopin, we know, was against that kind of thing. He was basically, I'd like to describe him as a classical composer condemned through a fault of history, a mistake, to wander through the 19th century, where he didn't belong. He didn't belong in the company of Liszt. He didn't belong in the company of Berlioz. He didn't even belong in the company of Schumann, who to some extent was also a programmatic composer. All the others were. Here we have this composer who seemed to regard music almost like a mathematical abstraction, a beautiful thing in itself, something that works. The numbers support each other. And if you talk to a mathematician who just works in numbers, they will sometimes tell you it is like a work of art, and it gives us the same kind of pleasure as viewing a wonderful painting or listening to a marvelous piece of music. So I put Chopin in that category. And also we must bear in mind that we have his own word for this kind of thing. All you have to do is to look at his correspondence in later years when his music was being handled by Christian Wessel, his publisher in Britain. Now, Wessel was in the business of business, and he saw an opportunity when he started to publish Chopin's music for great sales by attaching ridiculous nicknames. Two Nocturnes, Opus 37, I think he called them Soupir, two sighs. Chopin was appalled when he was approached by a lady in Scotland in 1848 with the request, would you please play me your second sigh? I mean, he had no idea what she was talking about, but that was on the music which he brought to him. One wonders, in fact, whether Wessel had even heard the B-flat minor scherzo when he decided to give it the appellation, the meditation. I mean, meditation is the last thing you think of in connection with that scherzo. But there we are. He was in the business of business, and we have Chopin's word for it. He called him a fool and a swindler. And he said, if Wessel continues like this, I'll break off all contact with him. Signed, Frederick Chopin. We have these letters to his great buddy, personal friend, Julian Fontana. So that's where Chopin stands on this matter, and I have to stand with him on it.
You mentioned Chopin's almost abstract geometrical or mathematical, like absolute music that he composed. He has that in common with J.S. Bach. And I wonder if you could speak to Bach's influence, both on Chopin's musicianship in general, dating back to his childhood, but also specifically these preludes.
Yes. The influence of J.S. Bach on Chopin's music is deep and profound. And it started in his earliest years, because his first and only piano teacher, Adalbert Gviny, introduced him to the 48 Preludes and Fugues from his earliest years. And Chopin mastered them. He knew them all 48, but he mastered them to such an extent that many years later, in the course of a lesson, one of his pupils who kept a diary recorded him playing 5 or 6 Preludes and Fugues from Volume 1, one after another, from memory, years after his studies with Gviny. He took an edition of the 48 Preludes and Fugues to Parma with him, because he thought he could spend some time correcting what he thought were mistakes in this French publication. There's no question that when Bach takes the player through all 24 major and minor keys, both times in each volume, that Chopin had this plan in mind, although he does it in a different way. The preludes also go through all 24 major and minor keys, but in a very interesting way. They move through a rising circle of fifths. So every alternating prelude is in the relative minor of the major key of the one that preceded it. So to give a very simple example, you start in C, the next one is A minor. Then you jump up to G, the next one is E minor, then up to D major, and then the next one is B minor. So you can predict with certainty, because of that key scheme, that the very last one, number 24, is going to end in D minor. And what a death knell that is. It was predicted from the start that he had to end in D minor. And I think that D minor was a special key even to Chopin in those days, that it had been to many other composers, the key of death and damnation. And so, getting back to a point that you made, music as a reflection of the mind. There's no doubt in my mind that in that final D minor prelude, there was some death knocking at the door. He was very, very ill at that point. And it's not generally known, the French Musicological Society, they publish a volume under the editorship of Professor Eigeldinger of the first volume of Bach's 24 Preludes and Fugues, edited by Chopin. Now, I have it here. Not only do they have Chopin's metronome marks, how quickly to play the preludes and the fugues that follow, they have expression marks, diminuendo and crescendo marks, forte, piano, phrase marks, accented notes where voices come in with the leading fugue theme. And it's a clear indication that when Chopin played these works, he was not a musicologist. He was actually a romanticist. Whatever he might have been as a composer, as a performer, he was a full-blooded romantic, and he opened up all the stops when it came to playing these preludes and fugues.
I have to proceed with some caution here because I'm speaking to an eminent biographer, and obviously truth matters most of all. But I have an imagination about Chopin's composing of his D-flat prelude, especially with respect to the Weltenberg Clavier. I can imagine Chopin opening up the first book to the C-sharp major prelude, the enharmonic, the same key, but C-sharp major. And if you play the first three notes slowly of that prelude of Bach, it is the Raindrop Prelude. And I wonder if some of his ideas in the life of his mind, in this inner world, didn't come almost directly from Bach in this manner, where he said, hey, this prelude slowed down and given a kind of a different setting. I'll begin it just like Bach and then take it in a new direction. I don't know. I think about that, and I actually perform these two as a pair back to back because I think they're so striking in how they begin in such similar ways, but then obviously move to very different places.
Yeah. No, I agree with you entirely, but it goes deeper than that, because I think it was Charles Rosen who insisted, and I agree with him entirely, that Chopin was one of the great contrapuntists of the 19th century. There are melodies all over the place inside Chopin's textures, and all you have to do is to listen to the music, and you can hear these melodies striving for expression, striving to get out. Now, it's true that sometimes eager pianists who want to be known as Chopin players, they go a little too far, and they bring out melodies that aren't even there. But the fact is that inside Chopin's textures are very often melodies that are beautiful, that are hidden, until someone comes along and says, look, I can bring this out. There's a melody in here.
I actually got a comment on one of my YouTube videos recently. Actually, it was a post that I made, and it shows Chopin's piano that he composed on. And one of the comments said, I've been to Valldemossa, and I'm pretty sure that that's a tourist trap, they said. Could you speak to this? Is there some controversy over the particular instrument?
Yes. I mean, to cut to the chase, the genuine playable piano that finally did arrive about 3 weeks before Chopin was due to leave Valldemossa, on which he brought the preludes to completion, that today is on exhibition in cell number 4. It is the genuine instrument. There's no doubt about that. All you have to do is to check the model number against the workbooks of the Pleyel factory in Paris. There's no question that that piano, which by the way is now not playable, or at least it is not played on, because it certainly needs some serious restoration work. In cell number 2, the rival cell, run by the Ferrer family for many, many years, as opposed to the Quakelas family in cell number 4, that piano was an inferior Majorcan instrument made by the Oliver brothers. And for many years, it was exhibited as and acknowledged as Chopin's piano. We have photographs of some leading musicians who were misled by the propaganda of the Ferrer family that this was the genuine instrument. We have Alfred Cortot looking lovingly at it with his right hand on top of the lid. We have General Franco and his political entourage going there to worship at the wrong shrine. We have Penderecki, the composer, looking at this instrument, which supposedly gave birth to all this wonderful music. And we have concert pianists, whom I greatly admire, and therefore refuse to identify on this program, who also fell into the same tourist trap. The tourist trap is cell number 2, and it was all brought to a head in a lawsuit that took place in 2010, the anniversary of Chopin's birth. And a judge from a civil court in Parma took a jury up the mountain to Valldemossa to inspect the cells and the instruments for themselves. And they delivered a judgment which must have been devastating for the Ferrer family because they appealed it, and they lost the appeal as well. That not only was their cell not the cell that Chopin and George Sand had occupied, but the piano had nothing to do with Chopin either, being an instrument that was built many years after Chopin had died. Now, when I was there in Valldemossa just 2 weeks ago, I noticed when I went into cell number 2 that this phony piano, the Majorcan piano, had been removed. So presumably the word has got out, and now it is in everyone's best interests for cell number 2 not to advertise an instrument that the whole world knows is not the genuine one. But the cell number 4 is the Pleyel piano.
Do we know what happened to the original primitive Majorcan instrument that was the first, I guess, the piano Chopin was actually initially writing and working out his ideas on?
It's because that original wretched Majorcan piano, in George Sand's words, was lost, that it was possible for the Ferrer family to claim that their piano was the genuine article. We don't know where that original Majorcan piano got to, but there's a very interesting piece of documentation in cell number 4 in the record books, because on the very day that the genuine Pleyel piano was delivered, early in January of 1839, Chopin was to leave there the following month, so he didn't have a lot of time to work on this wonderful instrument and bring his preludes to perfection. And on the very day that that instrument was delivered, George Sand was charged for the cartage cost of 2 pianos. 2 pianos. But only 1 piano was delivered. Wait a moment. That second charge must have been for the piano it replaced to be taken back. So that is the prevailing wisdom on the Majorcan piano, and we don't know where it was taken back to, and it has disappeared. Scholars can be misled, and entire books can be written about instruments that were worthless and arguments which have no foundation in research.
I have a very simple question. Do you have a favorite prelude?
Yes, the F minor, the one that begins with the recitative, as far as one can have a favorite. For me, it speaks on a very deep level.
Here is Polish pianist Wojciech Świtała performing Chopin's F minor prelude on an 1848 Pleyel. This episode has been brought to you by the Chopin Foundation of the United States. Established by Lady Blanca Rosenstiel in 1977, the Chopin Foundation has championed the music of Chopin and helped launch the careers of countless young American pianists for nearly a half-century. To support the Chopin Foundation, visit chopin.org/donate.
I've been to Miami and the Chopin Foundation there several times, and I've given lectures. Barbara Muse is a dear friend of mine. I've written articles for the magazine she edits, Polonaise magazine. My contacts with Miami go back at least 15 years, because one of my dear musicological friends, Professor Frank Cooper, lives there. And he's known as the Maven of Florida. And he has given many lectures for the Chopin Foundation as well. So my links with Florida and Miami in particular are very long-lasting and really quite profound.